Hello. Today General Hospital will reveal news of Daisy's disappearance didn't merely rattle the Quartermain estate, it detonated a shockwave that surged across Port Charles, tearing through the town's fragile layers of trust, family ties, and long-buried secrets like a relentless storm. The nightmare began when Sasha, upon entering the nursery, was met not with the peaceful sight of her sleeping infant, but with a chilling, empty cradle. Her scream echoed down the corridor like the crack of a gunshot, slicing through the mansion's calm as she ran in blind panic, colliding with Michael and delivering the devastating words every parent dreads: someone had taken their daughter. In that instant, the light in Sasha's eyes was snuffed out, replaced by a terror so primal, so consuming, that even Michael, known for his emotional restraint, stood frozen in disbelief. The trauma Sasha had fought for years to heal resurfaced in a single breath, and the name Daisy, meant to represent new life, hope, and redemption, was now wrapped in a cruel shroud of fear. As the devastating news spread, the town swiftly pivoted from grief to speculation, with fingers pointing toward Willow. She had visited the Quartermain estate the morning of Daisy's disappearance, and with her recent mental health decline following the loss of custody of Wiley and Amelia, the narrative that Willow had suffered a dissociative break quickly gained momentum. People recalled her courtroom collapse, her erratic behavior, the vacant stares, and the cryptic statements that had begun to punctuate her conversations. Whispers began to circulate that Willow may have developed dissociative identity disorder, and that one of her alternate personas, desperate to fill the void left by her children, may have stolen Daisy in a misguided attempt to reclaim motherhood. It didn't help that Willow had been present during Daisy's birth, knew the mansion's security and layout, and had shown signs of emotional instability since the custody verdict. The puzzle pieces fit together almost too perfectly. And that very perfection sparked doubt among those who knew the deeper games that haunted Port Charles. Indeed, the entire theory felt too convenient to Jason, who had long since learned that the most obvious suspect is rarely the true culprit. While Willow faced the weight of growing public condemnation and the Quartermains began eyeing her with suspicion, Sidwell, from the shadows, watched the chaos with quiet, chilling satisfaction. Once considered a brilliant strategist within the intelligence community, Sidwell had now evolved into something far more dangerous, a man with nothing left to lose and a vendetta that burned like acid through his veins. He had not forgotten what Holly had done to him, how she had infiltrated his network, humiliated him, and left him a disgrace among his peers. And now, as fate would have it, he had the chance to deliver retribution not just to her, but to her bloodline. To Sidwell, Daisy wasn't merely the child of Sasha. She was Holly's granddaughter, and in his mind, she represented the one thing he could steal that would cut deeper than any betrayal ever inflicted upon him. But Sidwell wasn't reckless. He didn't act with brute force or wild emotion. Instead, he orchestrated a surgical strike. He paid a phantom, someone with no name, no footprint, no history, an invisible hand that slipped through the Quartermain security system with surgical precision. The surveillance footage during the window of Daisy's disappearance had been wiped in exactly 1 minute and 49 seconds, without triggering a single alert. No DNA, no disturbance, no struggle. Just silence, and then absence. Jason, when shown the security logs, immediately knew the signature of the operation. There was only one man who could pull that off. And that man was Sidwell. While the town busied itself debating Willow's mental state, Michael secretly launched his own investigation. He reached out to his WSB contacts, accessed encrypted intel channels, and pulled every string left at his disposal. But each lead vanished almost as soon as it surfaced. Witnesses recanted. Digital traces disappeared. It was as if someone were scrubbing the timeline in real time, someone with immense power and institutional knowledge. Meanwhile, Sasha fell deeper into psychological torment, hearing phantom cries of her daughter at night, waking drenched in sweat with Daisy's name on her lips. Her instincts told her the danger wasn't coming from within her circle, but from something older, colder, more deliberate. In her desperation, she turned to Jason, whose unwavering presence offered the first semblance of hope. Jason began to retrace every step, not from the lens of suspicion against Willow, but from the angle of misdirection. He studied the timeline, the gaps, the silences, the minute anomalies no one else considered meaningful. The missing security footage, the odd timing of Willow's arrival, the quietness of the break-in, and above all, the absence of any real trail. He saw a pattern not of chaos, but of deliberate orchestration. When he reviewed the security breach and saw how precisely the intrusion had been timed to coincide with Sasha stepping out for a phone call, it became clear, this wasn't the act of a desperate woman. This was a calculated message. And only Sidwell would craft a message that cruel. Jason's conclusion shifted the entire narrative. He confronted Michael privately and laid out the pieces. They both realized that accusing Sidwell publicly without proof would only drive him deeper underground. Instead, they planned a trap, one that involved using what Sidwell craved most, attention. Meanwhile, Sasha, haunted but increasingly lucid, recalled a peculiar moment days before Daisy vanished. Sidwell had visited the hospital under the pretense of finalizing a business deal. During their brief interaction, he asked her with eerie calmness if she believed a mother could ever truly recover from losing her child. At the time, it seemed like a cruel philosophical jab. Now, it felt like a veiled threat. As the investigation intensified behind closed doors, Emma joined the effort, using her connections and intuition to reach out to Marco, Sidwell's estranged son. Emma had long suspected Marco of being caught in his father's psychological web, and her suspicions deepened when he began displaying signs of agitation and inner conflict. One evening, under the guise of casual conversation, Marco let something slip. A cryptic reference to a safe room and a photograph he once saw on his father's phone, a baby girl lying on a patterned blanket, unfamiliar, sterile surroundings, and a woman wearing surgical gloves cradling her. Emma immediately reported this to Jason. From that point forward, the operation moved swiftly. Anna activated dormant assets from her WSB years. A covert strike was approved. Jason, Michael, and a team of specialists followed the trail to a secluded compound on the outskirts of New Jersey, an abandoned CIA outpost converted into a private facility. There, under high-security surveillance, Sidwell stood calmly holding Daisy in his arms, smiling as though he had just won a chess match. When confronted, he offered no resistance, only whispered, "This is justice, not for me, but for what Holly stole." Daisy was rescued, unharmed but traumatized. Sidwell was taken into custody but refused to divulge how many others had aided him. For Willow, the apology was public and tearful, but the damage to her psyche was deep. Sasha entered treatment to recover from the emotional assault. Michael struggled with guilt for misjudging the people closest to him. Jason, despite the victory, knew this was only the beginning of a darker war with a man who would never stop calculating from the shadows. And as for poor Charles, it was left raw, exposed, and quieter than usual, as the town collectively absorbed the lesson that monsters don't always hide in madness. Sometimes, they hide in plain sight, wearing the face of strategy, revenge, and absolute control. While Michael continued to struggle under the immense weight of conflicting responsibilities, shielding Willow from the intensifying scrutiny of the public while simultaneously navigating the heartbreaking futility of his search for Daisy. It was Emma who chose to step into the shadows and take action. Emma had always shared a deep emotional bond with Sasha, forged in the fires of shared grief and mutual strength. She had seen firsthand the toll Daisy's disappearance was taking on her friend and knew that simply waiting for answers would no longer suffice. As she quietly observed the chaos swirling around the Quartermain estate, her instincts began to focus on a figure that many others had overlooked. Marco, the enigmatic and increasingly erratic son of Sidwell. Emma had noticed that Marco's recent behavior had become uncharacteristically inconsistent. His temper flared without provocation, he appeared distracted, anxious, and at times, he seemed as if he were carrying the weight of an unspoken truth. Having once exchanged pleasantries with him at a fundraiser and knowing he harbored a strained relationship with his father, Emma seized the opportunity to establish a deeper connection. Under the guise of casual conversation and genuine concern, she began gently probing into his thoughts. At first, Marco remained evasive, responding with vague platitudes about stress and uncertainty. But Emma, patient and perceptive, steered the dialogue toward Sidwell, mentioning in passing that she had heard rumors about him plotting something big, something meant to hurt someone from his past. That was the moment Marco froze. It was fleeting, but undeniable. A flicker of fear, of recognition, passed through his eyes. Emma pressed no further that day, allowing the silence to speak for itself. But the seed of doubt had been planted. Days later, Marco sought her out in a park on the edge of town, clearly agitated, torn between loyalty and guilt. It was then, under the golden light of dusk and trembling breath, that he whispered the unthinkable: he had seen Daisy. Not in person, but in a photograph hidden within an encrypted folder on Sidwell's private phone. The image burned into his mind, Daisy lying still, her eyes closed, wrapped in a white blanket patterned with small lavender flowers, surrounded by sterile, clinical walls. Beside her stood a woman in surgical scrubs and a medical mask, her identity obscured but her posture strangely maternal. Marco didn't know where the room was, but he knew without question that his father had orchestrated it all, and that Daisy was alive. When Emma delivered this information to Jason, the calm and collected man transformed into a storm barely contained. Years of experience had taught Jason how to keep his emotions in check, but this was different. This was personal. Jason immediately mobilized, coordinating with Michael and leveraging every remaining contact he had in the WSB. Sidwell had gone too far. The man who once played games of political leverage and psychological manipulation had crossed into a realm of cruelty from which there was no return. And Jason knew, this would not end with negotiation. This would end with retribution. Meanwhile, Sasha descended into a harrowing spiral of psychological collapse. Days blurred together in a haze of grief and confusion. She began to hear Daisy's cries in the middle of the night, soft whimpers that faded before she could locate their source. Sometimes she would wake in a cold sweat, convinced she had just held her daughter, only to find her arms empty. The trauma fractured her sense of reality, and even Sasha, in moments of painful lucidity, began to question her own sanity. But then came the memory, the conversation she had buried, dismissed as strange but harmless. Just days before Daisy disappeared, Sidwell had appeared at the hospital under the guise of resolving an investment dispute. Their conversation had been brief, but his words now replayed in her mind with terrifying clarity. He had leaned in slightly and asked, with unnerving serenity, "Do you believe a mother could ever truly forgive someone who steals her child?" At the time, she thought it was just Sidwell being his usual cryptic self. But now, it felt like a prophecy, a warning, disguised as curiosity. Her instincts, once drowned out by trauma and chaos, surged forward with terrifying force. Sidwell had never come for her, he had come for Holly. Sasha, through no fault of her own, had become the perfect pawn in a vendetta decades in the making. As the Quartermaines focused their attention on Willow, caught in a swirl of suspicion and emotional collapse, Sidwell executed his plan with chilling precision. While the world pointed fingers at a grieving, unstable mother, he quietly chartered a private jet, bypassing commercial airspace and disappearing from Port Charles under the radar. Daisy, sedated and unaware, was placed in a medical isolation pod and flown to a facility so remote, so thoroughly insulated from modern surveillance, that no satellite could track its existence. The compound, nestled deep within a mountainous region once used by an abandoned arm of the CIA, had been repurposed by Sidwell as both a sanctuary and a prison, an echo chamber of his madness, haunted by every grudge he had nurtured over the years. Inside, Sidwell sat alone in a room bathed in artificial light, cradling Daisy as though she were his own. Around them were remnants of his past, photographs of failed missions, news clippings of betrayals, fragments of his identity that had been dismantled piece by Holly. To him, Daisy was not a child. She was a symbol, a vessel of generational vengeance. In stealing her, he wasn't just hurting Sasha, he was delivering what he saw as justice to Holly in the most brutal, irrevocable way. And in his deluded mind, the world's outrage would never find him. They would remain preoccupied with the wrong suspect, the wrong theory, the wrong path, while he created a world where only he, and the echoes of the past, could speak. But outside those fortified walls, the noose around him began to tighten. Jason had already decrypted Marco's tip and traced it to several shell companies, one of which was linked to an abandoned logistics route used by rogue intelligence units during the early 2000s. With Anna's help and WSB authorizations pushed through under emergency protocols, a task force was assembled. The mission was simple: find Daisy, extract her, and bring Sidwell to justice, by any means necessary. And as that operation unfolded with ruthless precision, Port Charles held its breath, unaware that the true monster was not in the mirror of mental illness or emotional instability, but cloaked in strategic vengeance, hiding behind an old name, and holding an innocent child as collateral for sins that had long passed into memory. As the final threads of Sidwell's plot unraveled and the full magnitude of his deception came into view, the rescue mission ignited with a sense of urgency and raw emotional fire that scorched through every layer of Port Charles's fragile calm. What had started as a search for a missing infant evolved into a deep-state manhunt, pulling in every hidden contact and buried favor that Anna had accrued over a lifetime of espionage. She knew they were not simply dealing with a kidnapper. They were facing a man who had weaponized grief, a tactician whose brilliance had metastasized into something monstrous. Her every decision was laced with the knowledge that if they faltered for even a moment, Daisy could disappear forever into a black hole of vengeance. Anna's coordination with Jason and Michael was a thing of desperate precision. Jason, driven by guilt and his unwavering moral code, operated as both a warrior and a bloodhound. Moving through digital trails, encrypted comms, and black market intelligence with the same cold efficiency that had made him a legend in the underworld. Michael, though emotionally devastated, proved himself a man transformed, no longer the boy who reacted, but a father who hunted. He used the Quartermain name, the Corinthos legacy, and his own buried connections to squeeze information from sources who hadn't been touched in years. The triad of grief, rage, and purpose drove them across jurisdictions, through walls of classified intel, and finally to the abandoned WSB compound tucked into the folds of remote, government-forgotten wilderness. The mission that followed was executed without pomp, without red tape. Just a call to arms delivered in hushed tones across encrypted lines. WSB field assets were activated, trusted veterans who owed Anna more than just allegiance. Jason briefed them with sharp clarity, masking his emotional investment beneath layers of tactical protocol. Michael remained silent during the insertion, his face carved from grief and fury, his only prayer that he would see his daughter alive. When they arrived, night had dropped over the landscape like a morning shroud. Fog hovered low, and the perimeter of the facility was shrouded in unnatural quiet. It was too still. Too perfect. And that's when they knew, Sidwell wasn't running. He was waiting. They entered with synchronized precision, clearing each hallway, room by room, weapons drawn, adrenaline burning. And then, they found him. Sidwell sat in a darkened chamber that looked like the nerve center of an old intelligence post. Fluorescent lights flickered above. Walls were lined with outdated mission files, torn photographs, maps, and notes scrawled in manic handwriting. At the center of this eerie shrine to his past, Sidwell sat in an armchair, holding Daisy with unsettling gentleness. She was asleep, her tiny body swaddled in sterile linens, unaware of the storm unfolding around her. He didn't move. He didn't resist. He merely looked up at the armed team, and a slow, hollow smile crept across his face. "I just gave Holly back the grief she so graciously bestowed upon me," he said, his voice low, calm, chilling. "It's not about the child. It's about the legacy. The echo. The reminder that the past does not fade, it recalibrates." No one spoke. Jason moved first, lifting Daisy from Sidwell's arms, his expression a blend of relief and restrained rage. The child whimpered but remained unharmed, her breathing steady. Sidwell made no move to stop him. He had already won in his own mind. The extraction team secured him without incident, but not without dread. Because there was something in his eyes, something hollow and unrepentant, that whispered this was far from over. Daisy was rushed back to Port Charles and reunited with Sasha under the supervision of a trauma response team. But the joyous moment was muted, even surreal. Sasha collapsed into tears, clutching her daughter as though to transfer her soul into the child's body. Her sobs were deep and primal. Her whispers incoherent. Though Daisy had been returned, a piece of Sasha's soul had been scorched by the ordeal. The damage, though invisible, was immense. Willow, meanwhile, stood alone in the shadows of the Quartermain estate. Though publicly exonerated, the emotional backlash she endured had fractured her. She could no longer walk through the halls of the house without remembering the suspicious glances, the whispered accusations, the subtle distancing of people she once trusted. The realization that she had become a scapegoat in Sidwell's psychological theater unraveled what remained of her composure. She began withdrawing further, canceling appointments, avoiding family dinners, shrinking into the corners of her own mind. Her therapists noted signs of chronic post-traumatic stress. She rarely mentioned Daisy, but often cried uncontrollably when she heard the sound of a baby laughing.